The people's growing discontent made Ukraine more vulnerable to outside forces, and a new kind of warfare was launched, one not known before, the color revolutions.
Demonstrators clashed with police, hundreds of thousands protesting the results of the election and calling for a new vote.
Ukraine has had two color revolutions in its 24 years of independence. In 2004, crowds of people descended upon Kiev, marking the start of the Orange Revolution. At that time, Ukraine became once again a battlefield of two forces, the Russian and Western governments. The culmination of this conflict took place during the presidential elections in November of 2004. The two major candidates, Western-backed Viktor Yushchenko and Russian-leaning Viktor Yanukovych, almost equally shared the votes of Ukrainians. By the way, calling Viktor Yushchenko Western-backed is not an exaggeration. His wife, Katerina Yushchenko, is a former U.S. State Department official and worked in the White House during the Reagan administration. The division was along geographic lines. Traditionally, Russian Eastern Ukraine voted for Yanukovych, while Western Ukraine chose Yushchenko. By the announced result, Viktor Yushchenko lost to Viktor Yanukovych, but thousands of people didn't agree with it, and they came to the central square of Kiev on the 22nd of November. The situation received wide news coverage.
The country's election commission ignored reports of fraud, declaring Kremlin-backed Viktor Yanukovych the winner.
International politicians, such as former General Secretary of NATO, Javier Solana, became frequent guests in Kiev, initiating negotiations between parties.
And I hope very much, and the goodwill of everybody, we will be able to overcome this difficulty.
The results of the negotiations, however, were often reached only on paper. Thus, Yushchenko never told the supporters to stop blocking government buildings in central Kiev. Therefore, these non-violent and very orange protests lasted for a month, during which time the previous election results were annulled, marred by massive corruption, and new elections were announced. An important nuance: just 3 months before, Viktor Yushchenko became a victim to a mysterious and still unsolved poisoning. But it didn't prevent him from winning in the new election. Though, as we shall soon see, there was much more than just the people's will that led to this victory. This peaceful revolution and its leader were warmly welcomed by the international community. But the euphoria didn't last long. Yushchenko's government completely failed with reforms and lost its chance to establish democracy, instead descending into infighting. Viktor Yushchenko was not re-elected for a second term, but at the end of his presidency, he had the time to make one last gift to his supporters from Western Ukraine.
На завершення я хочу сказати про те, що чекали мільйони українських патріотів і багато років. Я підписав указ за незламність духу у відстоюванні національної ідеї, виявлені героїзм і самопожертву в боротьбі за незалежну українську державу. Постановляю присвоїти звання Герою України з удостоєнням ордена держави Бандері Степану Андрійовичу. Слава Україні!
The hero status of Stepan Bandera was short-lived. In 2010, Viktor Yanukovych was elected president. This time, the international community had no doubts about the legitimacy of the elections. In January 2011, Viktor Yanukovych repealed the hero title of Bandera. Almost 4 years into his presidency, though, another revolution shook Ukraine. Unfortunately, this one was anything but peaceful.
Mr. Yanukovych, I'm an American. I'm an outsider to this situation, and it's very complicated. But I would like, as a filmmaker, just to jump into the action and go to those moments in November 2013. You're president of the Ukraine. You've been president for 3 years at this point. The country is in bad economic shape, very bad. You have a trade agreement with Russia, and now you're seeking to make a better agreement with the EU, with the European Union, and you are negotiating. Can you bring me to that moment and what you're thinking?
Действительно, это был очень сложный период времени для Украины, и нам нужно было найти решение проблем в 2013 году. Поэтому у нас было два партнера. Прежде всего, мы рассчитывали на Международный валютный фонд. Но Международный валютный фонд на протяжении года, когда мы вели переговоры, нам предлагал неприемлемые для нас варианты решения. Значительное поднятие тарифов для населения, прежде всего на энергоносители и на газ, то есть значительный рост расходов населения, при том, что доходы оставались прежние. Мы на это не пошли. Мы предложили другие варианты решения вопросов. Мы получили официальный отказ Международного валютного фонда в ноябре 2013 года. Оставалась Россия. Россия нам сказала, что мы готовы с вами работать как партнеры, если вы учтете наши интересы.
Того, что экономика Украины и России зарождалась как единая экономика, сложились абсолютно уникальные, особые экономические отношения. Рынки в России были полностью открыты для украинских товаров, а при этом наши границы с Украиной таможенные полностью раскрыты. Таким образом, Евросоюз как бы заходил со всеми своими товарами на нашу территорию без всяких переговоров.
И когда мы начали считать балансы, мы увидели, что соглашение, которое подготовлено Европой для Украины, требует больших экономических расходов, компенсаций потерь, а Европа компенсаций не предлагает. При том, что российский рынок при этом для Украины частично сокращался или прикрывался.
Сказали, конечно, если Украина решила так поступить, это ее выбор, и мы уважаем этот выбор. Но мы не должны этот выбор оплачивать.
Наши переговоры с Европой не увенчались успехом. Поэтому на этом пути мы предложили сделать паузу.
Violent clashes erupted in the Ukrainian capital Kiev as more than 100,000 people protested against a government decision to delay an association deal with the EU.
Vitaly, you were Minister of Interior Affairs for the Ukraine during this period, and you were Chief of Police, essentially, of the country. Can you tell me your version of what happened from November protests through February protests?
Мы располагали информацией, что протестные акции в любом случае массово планируются и начнутся в 2015 году. Но оппозиция воспользовалась тем фактом, что в начале Кабинет министров, а затем и президент приняли решение временно отложить подписание ассоциации с Европейским Союзом.
Arseny Yatsenyuk, leader of the opposition party, Fatherland. Oleg Tagnibok, leader of the opposition nationalist far-right political party, Svoboda. Vitaly Klitschko, leader of the opposition party, Udar.
As both EU and Ukrainian officials said on Thursday, the suspension of talks on closer ties could be revived after the two-day meeting. But officials said the deal was off the table for now.
You expected more.
Pro-EU protests on the streets of Kiev enter their second day. The crowd of around 1,000 protesters were joined by the leader of the opposition, the reigning world boxing champion Vitaly Klitschko. He called on the demonstrators to maintain pressure on the government after it decided not to sign a major trade deal with the EU.
You go back to Kiev the next day after the meeting with Merkel, and the protests are up, am I right? Can you take me through that period?
Если у меня в самом начале было понимание того, что это мирные акции, и во время мирных акций можно вести диалог, и я к этому был готов.
И говоря о протестах ноября-февраля, необходимо обязательно учитывать динамику их развития, которая происходила на Украине заранее до того. Огромное количество общественных организаций, которые финансировались из-за рубежа, огромное количество журналистов, работающих на гранты.
Robert Perry is a longtime investigative journalist based in Washington, D.C., best known for his major disclosures about the Iran-Contra scandal in the 1980s. He is the founder of Consortium News, where he has reported extensively on the crisis in Ukraine and the forces behind the unrest.
An NGO is a non-governmental organization. Now, many NGOs are quite legitimate. They represent good causes. Maybe they help people in a country feed or deal with water problems or deal with various kinds of social problems. But there are some NGOs that have become funded by government entities and serve more the purpose of that government rather than trying to serve the people that they are ostensibly working for. One thing we saw in the 1980s, at that point the Central Intelligence Agency had been largely discredited because of scandals that had been exposed in the 1970s.
For 15 years, the CIA has secretly financed overseas activities of the National Students Association. But then there came to light a fantastic web of CIA penetrations.
So when the Reagan administration came in, there was this concept that instead of having the CIA, which traditionally would go into these different target countries, funding their media, funding NGOs, funding different political operations, that was essentially farmed out to a new organization called the National Endowment for Democracy, which was created in 1983. And it would do pretty much what the agency used to do. It would go into one of these countries and it would support various political groups, train activists, deal with journalists, business groups, and try to advance U.S. foreign policy interests, sometimes against the interests of the host government, the target government. And beyond that, they received financial and other logistical help from the National Endowment for Democracy and other U.S. agencies that helped them training activists, working with journalists to get their side presented more favorably. They work on things like, how do you get traction? How do you get things to go viral? How do you then use that to generate support for your cause?
And support was generated. Mustafa Nayyem, a founder of one of Ukraine's new media outlets, Hromadske TV, knew very well how to make something go viral. It was his notorious Facebook post on November 21, 2013, that brought the first crowds to Maidan.
Я це написав просто, щоб почути, чи є ці люди, чи просто поговоримо десь у Фейсбуці.
If you don't read the newspaper, you are uninformed. If you read the newspaper, you are misinformed. To deliver your message efficiently enough in the modern world with so many different technologies and means of communications, you must embrace them all. As the disturbing events of Euromaidan started on November 21, 2013, 3 new TV channels went on the air and suddenly became stunningly popular in Ukraine. Spilno TV, November 21st. Hromadske TV, November 22nd. And Espresso TV, November 24th, directly from opposition protest. These channels went viral, supporting the protests and encouraging more and more people to come to Maidan.
И первые выступления массовые начались 21 числа, 21 ноября. Сначала акции проходили мирно. На эти акции пришли люди разной категории. Это были молодые и пожилые люди, приходили с детьми. Явно было понятно, что с их стороны есть доверие к власти, в том числе и к правоохранителям, потому что свободно выходили. И никаких намеков на то, что будет в отношении этих манифестантов приниматься какие-то меры воздействия, силовые и так далее, просто не существовало. Значит, соответственно, на охрану общественного порядка выходили правоохранители без огнестрельного оружия. Но среди митингующих уже замечены нами радикалы, которые относились к правым партиям, неофашистским организациям. И 24 числа, 24 ноября, они осуществили первую агрессивную акцию. 24 числа первое было нападение на кабинет министров. И первое нападение на сотрудников правоохранителей, которые охраняли. Второе нападение на правоохранителей службы безопасности Украины произошло 25 числа. Затем небезызвестные события 30 числа.
November 30th of 2013 became the first turning point of Euromaidan and one of its most reported and mysterious events.
Я тогда немножко расскажу, как видел эти события я. Был звонок мне от Попова, глава администрации города Киева. Он говорил, что давайте сегодня мы хотели бы завозить оборудование для новогодней елки на площадь. Я ему объяснил, что до тех пор, пока люди находятся на площади, то этого делать нельзя. В районе часа ночи, когда массово люди начали расходиться, разъезжаться, я поговорил по телефону с руководителем службы безопасности Украины и спросил его точку зрения по развитию событий. Он сказал, я считаю, что, слава богу, все закончилось. Вся информация идет о том, что все закончилось. Потому что фактически с 21 числа, я в кабинете просто жил и спал там. Какое-то время, может быть, 2 часа в сутки удавалось поспать. Около 3 часов ночи я приехал тоже к себе домой. Завел часы на 6:30 утра. Включил телевизор сразу же, когда проснулся. Он у меня был настроен на 5-й канал. И 5-й канал демонстрирует большое количество скорой помощи. И там побитые люди.
After riot, police attacked peaceful protesters with clubs.
Happened in the early morning hours. Eyewitnesses that were there said that the police did use truncheons.
Меня, честно говоря, пробил просто холодный пот.
Моя первая реакция на то, что Майдан пострадал от действий полиции, была мгновенной. Нужно было расследовать, кто дал приказ разгонять митингующих, применять к ним силу. Я был противник того, чтобы к митингующим применялась сила, нарушали права людей.
Решений таких Попов самостоятельно принимать просто не мог. А кто для него был самый высокий руководитель? Для Попова был самый большой руководитель, это глава администрации. Сергей Владимирович Левочкин.
Coincidentally, Sergei Lovochkin is a close associate to many U.S. politicians. The Security Service of Ukraine had evidence that on that night, Lovochkin was in contact with opposition leader Yatsenyuk, where they discussed the clearing of Maidan on the pretext of installing the annual Christmas tree. News media reported that the riot police cruelly attacked the students peacefully sleeping in their tents. But scenes from the event seem to tell a different story. It appears that the protesters were waiting for the police. Additionally, there were dozens of journalists and cameramen from all the new public TV news outlets prepared to cover the events. And most ominously, a group of well-trained young men arrived to Maidan almost simultaneously with the riot police. They infiltrated the crowd and began provocations with insults, stones, and torches.
The right sector in Ukraine represents a part of the Ukrainian population that has often favored fairly extreme right-wing positions. They had militias that came especially during the Maidan protests. There were groups that were being shipped into Kiev where they would provide the muscle, in effect, for the demonstrations. So the demonstrations went from being relatively peaceful political protests to being increasingly violent.
The first step in any detective work is to establish a motive. It is now said that Sergei Lovochkin is held in high esteem by his powerful U.S. friends. Outraged by what was reported in the news, the Ukrainian people came out in force on the next day to vent their anger with the police actions.
The violence started to take off when?
Фактически жесткие противоправные действия начались уже в декабре 2013 года. События, которые проходили в тот период в Киеве, они были очень радикальные. В них принимали неонацистские организации, молодые люди, которые были различными вооружены различными средствами. Металлические прутья, биты. В том числе использовалась техника, например, дорожно-строительная, грейдерами, и они грейдерами наезжали на работников правоохранительных органов, на милицию, которая защищала и не давала захватить правительственные здания и здания администрации президента. Как президент мог такой неуправляемой толпе выйти и с кем говорить? Технологии, которые применялись в тот период времени, они были заранее спланированы.
As veiled and masked as the color revolutions can be, an attentive viewer can see subtle patterns and similarities revealing their true nature. To make crowds act as one obedient group, they have to be united at the unconscious level. The masterminds of color revolutions know this well and have perfected the art. Symbolism is one of the most powerful tools to achieve this end. Revolutionary political organizations with surprisingly similar names and even more similar logos have appeared time and again, almost as omens marking the countries that would be hit by the colored plague next. They are often described as being aware and active, when they're actually trained and radical. They are the ones who take the first shot, literal and metaphorical, to transform the peaceful protests into full-blown coups d'etats. Their fingerprints can be found everywhere on the map of the color revolutions. Using all the experience of past generations, simple but effective tools like catchy sing-alongs and chanting are employed. Well known for exciting the crowd and creating a group identity, they depersonalize individuals and make them easier to manipulate.
Конечно, без денег здесь не могло быть. Такое количество негосударственных, различных общественных организаций, грантов, которое выделялось на Украину, это не есть секретом.
Incidentally, one such organization, Hromadske TV, received generous donations from the Dutch and U.S. embassies, as well as from the Renaissance Foundation, an NGO founded by George Soros.
I set up a foundation in Ukraine before Ukraine became independent of Russia. And the foundation has been functioning ever since. And it played an important part in events now.
I like criticism, but it must be my way.
Did you see any evidence of U.S. involvement? Did you feel their presence from the U.S.?
Очень частыми гостями были представители Соединенных Штатов, конгрессмены, были госпожа Нуланд, приезжала очень часто, у нас были с ней дискуссии. Но после этих дискуссий она шла на Майдан и поддерживала протестующих. И обвиняла правоохранительные органы, применялась чрезмерно сила. На самом деле эти все месседжи мы видели на Майдане.
Well, members of Congress were visiting Ukraine during that period, most famously Congressman John McCain. So some of the people who were challenging their government, their elected government at that point, were being told by the senior U.S. official, a person who ran for president and a top official in the U.S. Congress, that the U.S. was with them.
I'm Senator John McCain, and it's always a pleasure to be back in Ukraine.
Senator McCain was, in a sense, giving the people in the Maidan a feeling that they had the backing of the most powerful country on earth.
This is about the future you want for your country. This is about the future you deserve.
Делегаций много приезжало. Я говорил, что нельзя говорить, во-первых, неправду. Нельзя становиться на сторону митингующих и отстаивать их права, создавая тем самым и углубляя конфликт. Когда митингующие захватывают правительственные здания и учреждения, скажите, допустимо ли это в любой другой стране, например, чтобы посол Украины пришел к митингующим в Фергюсоне и раздавал там пряники или пирожки и обвинял полицейских Соединенных Штатов Америки? Я считаю, что это недопустимо ни в одной европейской стране. А почему к Украине было такое отношение?
Who was your highest level contact with the U.S. government in this period?
Я постоянно имел контакт с господином Байденом, вице-президентом. У меня были частые с ним телефонные переговоры. Но дело в том, что господин Байден говорил одно, а в Украине делали другое.
And the ambassador?
Посол Соединенных Штатов в Украине постоянно принимал представителей Майдана у себя в посольстве. Мы это очень хорошо знали, мы это отслеживали. И создавалось такое впечатление, что в посольстве Соединенных Штатов существует штаб, который управляет этим процессом.
In early February of 2014, as the Maidan crisis was getting more violent, there was a phone call that was intercepted. It was a call between the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, Victoria Nuland, and the U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt.
Questions of credibility are being raised after a private chat between two top U.S. diplomats was leaked online.
I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, you know, what he needs is Klitsch and Tony Book on the outside. I just think Klitsch going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Okay. Good. Well, do you want us to try to set up a call with him as the next step?
Sullivan's come back to me, VFR, saying you need Biden, and I said probably tomorrow for an attaboy and to get the deets to stick. So okay. Biden's willing.
So you had this remarkable phone call where you have these two senior officials of the U.S. government apparently talking about a coup or how they were planning to restructure the government of Ukraine.
Fuck the EU.
No, exactly.
I'm not saying the whole U.S. government feels that way. There is division on this, but the neoconservative element wants very much to change the strategic dynamic in Eastern Europe. The neocons are very smart people, and they've been at this for a long time. They came in around the issue of propaganda. They studied how to create hot buttons for the American people. They had this experience when they were getting the American people to get excited about Central America back in the 1980s.
Sandinista regular army. The ground force is being equipped now with Russian artillery.
And they've been applying those same strategies ever since. They remain very dedicated to achieving their goals. They still want to get rid of certain governments. They wanted a regime change in Syria, for instance, regime change in Iran. They're very skilled at this, and they have a lot of allies now inside the news media, inside the government, and that means that they can do a lot to control the narrative of any story.
I think in America these days, we have somehow told ourselves that there are a lot of ways of dealing with these problems other than hard power. Vladimir Putin cares about hard power.
The neoconservatives can now demonize a leader of a country. That sells with the American people. So you don't just sort of argue a policy. You attack the leader. So the neoconservatives became very skilled at picking out leaders, finding their ugly traits, and then highlighting them. Yanukovych, you might say, was a rather clunky political leader, but you make him into a devil. He's totally corrupt, and he's evil, and he wants to kill people in the Maidan, these wonderful white-hatted demonstrators. So you've got a black hat versus white hat, you keep repeating that basic scenario, and it works with the American people.
You've got to realize what Vladimir Putin is. He's an old KGB colonel that wants to restore the Russian Empire.
You make them into demons, and the American people find that the way they can understand the world. Once that happens, it's very difficult for a journalist or anyone else to say, you know, hold it, that guy, he's got more of a gray hat than a white hat or a black hat. And if you say that, you're a Yanukovych apologist or you're a Putin apologist, and then the attacks come on to the person saying it, the journalist, the academic, or whoever.
Any good director will tell you that tempo and rhythm are the most essential components to hold an audience's attention.
Сама технология, которая применялась Майданом, состояла в необходимости сакральных жертв. Это часть технологии.
It can also be called a method of betrayal, when the allies and followers are relentlessly thrown into the revolutionary flame. The idea is simple. When the preparation work is done, the trigger just needs to be pulled to set the machine into full motion.